Good afternoon, sisters and brothers, friends of peace. Today marks the 60th anniversary of the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There is no better occasion for peace movements and peace-supporting people in Canada to call for Canada's unilateral withdrawal from NATO as a first step to dissolving the organization entirely. Today also marks the 60th anniversary of the World Peace Council, of which the Canadian Peace Congress is part of, which was formed in response to the formation of NATO back in 1949. Since its inception, NATO has been an aggressive military alliance whose sole purpose is to be the self-appointed enforcement officer for the strategic and economic interests of Western capitalist states. The alliance started out as an anti-Soviet institution of the Cold War, taking in countries in North America and Europe, and dominated by the military-industrial complex of the United States. The end of the Cold War meant the vaporization of its mission to contain communism, and NATO itself should have disappeared. Instead, the military alliance has expanded both in membership and in scope, and drawn more countries into its role of controlling and directing the resources of the world toward the benefit of the capitalist countries, and particularly U.S. imperialism and U.S. capitalism. The shift in NATO's role is exemplified by its aggression against Yugoslavia. After several years of harassment and interference, NATO began bombing Yugoslavia in 1999. And I'd like to point out, we can remember that Canadian warplanes were at the front of that bombing effort, sending our F-16s. Under the pretense of humanitarian intervention, but with the very clear objective of breaking up the last socialist-orientated country in Europe and forcibly reorientating it toward a neoliberal capitalist economic model. In the middle of the bombing campaign, NATO's chief gathered for a gala celebration of the alliance's 50th anniversary to announce NATO's new strategic concept. That strategic concept carries on today, which extended its scope beyond the North Atlantic arena and allowed it to militarily attack anywhere in the world on humanitarian grounds. The war against Yugoslavia revealed much of NATO's humanitarian vision. The bombing campaign was savage, unilateral, and criminal, and it resulted in a destroyed infrastructure and thousands of dead and displaced civilians. And it's interesting to note that today, the outgoing General Secretary of NATO, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, said in his opening remarks to NATO, he said, "It is my view to underline NATO's determination to perform the full range of its missions, from its core task of collective defense to projecting stability abroad." So NATO's position and its ongoing position, its strategic mission, is to project its role as a military alliance and to defend the interests of U.S. imperialism abroad. NATO's ongoing war against Afghanistan is the current theater of operations for this new strategic concept, and it clearly exposes the intent of U.S. imperialism and its NATO and EU allies to perpetuate in the 21st century the cycle of wars, of aggression, militarization, and economic crisis that characterized the 20th century. Afghanistan represents two significant and troublesome firsts for the alliance. It is the first time NATO has undertaken a mission outside of the North Atlantic arena, and it is the first time that the alliance's mutual defense clause has been invoked. Both of these developments were nothing less than a desperate attempt to secure a role for NATO in the world. Specifically, NATO and its core membership of world imperialist states have used the war in Afghanistan to secure a foothold in the resource-rich areas of Asia, controlling strategic pipeline routes and encircling China and Russia. Shamefully, successive Canadian governments, both liberal and conservative, have supported and facilitated NATO's role in the world. Canada participated in the wars against Yugoslavia and Afghanistan, and it was the Canadian Minister of National Defence, John McCallum, who facilitated the transfer of command of the Afghanistan mission from the United Nations to NATO. The current government of Stephen Harper is working feverishly to convince other countries to commit troops to the war against Afghanistan in an effort to prolong that conflict and secure the long-term strategic aims of the alliance. Canada's participation in NATO and its complicity with the alliance's policy of aggression and domination is not only a threat to world peace, but it is an increasingly dangerous and self-destructive policy for Canada. Canada's membership in NATO requires an abdication of Canadian sovereignty in the areas of military and foreign policy, and necessarily means that a growing amount of domestic legislation is subject to the policies of the military alliance. For example, through NATO membership, Canada is committed to helping to pay for the maintenance of NATO's nuclear armaments around the world and to develop contributing to NATO's nuclear policy. This impacts directly on the Canadian government policies towards resource and industrial development in Canada. And it should also be noted here that it wasn't long ago in 2007 in July where there was an agreement on civil defense agreement that was concluded in secret in Dallas-Fort Worth in U.S. military bases, which will allow U.S. troops onto Canadian soil in the event of a civil emergency. Also, we can see it right here in Alberta in terms of our economy. U.S. and NATO warplanes annually consume 2.5 billion gallons of jet fuel, which translates roughly into about 283,000 barrels a day of oil that needs to be produced to keep those warplanes flying. The Stelmach government has a policy of exporting our raw bitumen to those very same refineries in the U.S. that produce that jet fuel to keep those American warplanes and NATO warplanes flying. This is right here in Alberta, and this has to stop. It not only does it have to stop, it is destroying the economy of Alberta when we solely supply our resources to keep the U.S. industrial complex going. NATO's strategic view of the Middle East and the role that the state of Israel plays in that vision has undoubtedly been a factor in the dramatic changes in Canada's foreign policy towards Palestine, which is now nothing more than parroting of Washington policy. Furthermore, NATO's current exercises and build-up in the oil-rich areas of Africa will no doubt place pressure on the Canadian government to circumvent the democratic process as it frames its foreign policy towards this area. Canada's withdrawal from NATO is a necessary first step to securing an independent foreign policy of peace, disarmament, and international cooperation for Canada. This has been the policy of the Canadian Peace Congress since 1949. And with that, people, what we see now with the foreign policy of Harper towards the opening up of the Arctic to U.S. Military and building deep water ports, the Canadian Peace Congress is calling that we declare the Arctic a zone of peace and international cooperation, that it does not become a militarized zone for U.S. warships traveling through the Northwest Passage. Wherever NATO intervenes in the world, it commits and encourages flagrant violations of basic principles of international law and the founding Charter of the United Nations. As a global military alliance, its very formation contravened the provisions of the Charter of the newly formed United Nations. In the 6 decades since NATO has sought to undermine the UN's mission to bring peace to the world. NATO's long-standing policy of first strike or preemptive attack and its maintenance of its right to use nuclear weapons are both outright violations of the precepts of the United Nations. And we should also be aware that the growth of NATO is intensifying the armaments race, and the threat of nuclear war is growing. It is not diminishing right now, and it is becoming a very clear danger to the people of the world. The threat of global warming is great, but in a nuclear conflagration, that question will be resolved in an instant. We must remember that. Clearly, the time has come for a massive movement of people calling for the dissolution of NATO and all military alliances, and replacing it with the instruments that facilitate equal and genuine cooperation and relations between states based on respect for sovereignty and self-determination. On the occasion of the 60th anniversary of NATO, the Canadian Peace Congress calls for such a mobilization and launches its own campaign for Canada to withdraw from NATO. It is up to the people in NATO countries to stop the drive to war. The military-industrial complex of the United States and its allies around the world must be stopped. A new progressive democratic world order is possible. As a first step, the Canadian Peace Congress encourages all peace-supporting people in Canada to mark the 60th anniversary of NATO's formation by taking action to force Canada's immediate and unilateral withdrawal from NATO. Thank you very much.